You know, for billions of people, the New Testament is this incredibly foundational book. But what if I told you that its oldest secrets aren't actually in the stories it tells, but in the ones it quotes? Okay, let's dive into this, because we are about to go on a historical detective hunt to find the very first Christian beliefs. So here's the central puzzle for historians, right? How in the world do we know what the very first Christians actually believed? Think about it. Jesus died around 30 AD, but our earliest Christian writings, Paul's letters, they don't even show up until the 50s AD. That's a 20-year gap, an entire generation of what looks like, well, silence. So what was going on in those absolutely crucial early years? Well, it turns out the answer is kind of hidden in plain sight, embedded deep within the New Testament itself. You see, scholars have discovered these amazing things they call textual fossils. These are tiny, ancient fragments of oral tradition, things like creeds, hymns, little confessions, that are actually much older than the books they ended up in.
So, how do we actually find them? This is where it gets fun. Let's open up our historical detectives toolkit. We're going to look at the specific clues that scholars use to spot these ancient bits of faith that people were saying and singing long before anyone ever wrote them down.
So how do you spot one of these fossils in the wild? Well, this little checklist gives us the main clues. First, it often has this poetic, really structured feel to it. It just doesn't sound like regular storytelling. It might also use some unique words, vocabulary that the author, like Paul, doesn't use anywhere else. It also presents a complete self-contained idea. And here's the real giveaway. You can often just lift it right out of the text, and the sentence it was in still makes perfect sense without it. All right, time to put our tools to the test. Let's open our first case file. We're heading straight to the beginning of Paul's letter to the Romans, where he appears to be quoting a very, very early creed about the two natures of Jesus. Here it is. Paul says the gospel is concerning his Son, who was descended from David according to the flesh and was declared to be the Son of God in power by his resurrection from the dead. I mean, just listen to that. Hear the rhythm, that balanced parallelism? It just feels different from the rest of Paul's writing, doesn't it? And what this does is so brilliant. It gives us this two-stage understanding of Jesus. On the one hand, according to the flesh, he's the human Messiah, a descendant of King David, planted firmly in Jewish history. But on the other hand, according to the Spirit of holiness, he is the divine Son of God, and that status was powerfully proven or vindicated by his resurrection. Okay, let's move on to our next case file, and you'll see how this idea builds. Now, this one is a big one, the Christ hymn in Philippians chapter 2. Seriously, most scholars are convinced that Paul is quoting an early Christian hymn here, one he didn't write, but one that was probably being sung in churches. The hymn talks about one who, although he was in the form of God, emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. Therefore, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name. I mean, wow, the language is just soaring, It tells a complete cosmic story in just a handful of lines. So the trajectory here is what's absolutely crucial. The hymn lays out this clearer four-step journey. It kicks off with pre-existence, Jesus existing in the form of God. Then comes the incarnation, where he emptied himself to become human. After that, his ultimate humiliation, death on a cross. And finally, his exaltation, where God raises him up so high that every knee should bow. It's a whole narrative arc, right there. But here's the real kicker. That phrase, every knee should bow, is a direct quote from the Old Testament book of Isaiah. And in Isaiah, it's talking exclusively about Yahweh, about God himself. This early hymn takes praise that was reserved only for the one God of Israel and applies it directly to Jesus. This is an unbelievably high view of who Jesus is, and it's happening very, very early on. So, we've looked at the evidence, right? What do these incredible textual fossils actually reveal when we put them all together? What's the bigger picture they're painting for us about those very first Christian beliefs? Well, the picture they're painting is something theologians call a high Christology. And this isn't just a belief that Jesus was, a special prophet or a human Messiah. No, this is the belief that he was divine, that he shared in the very nature and essence of God. So, what's the final verdict from our little detective mission? Well, these creeds show us, pretty clearly, that the belief in Jesus' divinity was not some late invention that evolved over a century. They show that the resurrection was seen as the central, game-changing event. And they reveal that from the very beginning, Jesus was understood as both fully human and fully divine.
These weren't some fringe ideas. They were foundational.
And listen, our two case files aren't even close to being alone. This pattern is everywhere once you know what to look for. There's a hymn in 1 Timothy that talks about him being manifested in the flesh, vindicated in the spirit. Hey, that sounds familiar, right? There's a baptismal formula in Romans 10 that links salvation to confessing Jesus is Lord and believing God raised him. And one of the most ancient little fragments we have in Luke 24 is this simple, powerful declaration: the Lord is risen indeed and has appeared to Simon. It's a consistent, widespread pattern of belief right from the get-go.
Okay, so why does all of this historical detective work really matter in the end? What's the big picture here? What's the big takeaway from digging up these ancient little pieces of faith?
The key takeaway is this: these creedal statements, these little hymns and confessions, they are our earliest historical data for Christianity. Period. They're like a time capsule, preserving for us the core beliefs from that crucial, so-called silent period between 30 and 50 AD. They give us a direct window into the ideas that were fueling the Christian movement in its absolute infancy, even before the Gospels were written.
And that leaves us with one last, just fascinating question to chew on. If these incredibly complex and high beliefs about Jesus, as both the human Messiah and the divine Son of God, were already established and being sung in churches within just a few years of his death, what on earth does that tell us about the truly explosive origins of the Christian faith?